a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" This story is often called the stilling of the storm, and it's been interpreted figuratively since the days of the church fathers. It appears in all three of the synoptic gospels. St. Chrysostom said that the boat signifies the struggles of the Christian life. God's people are awakened by spiritual assaults and become aware of their helplessness. They call upon the Lord for salvation and inner peace. That's St. Chrysostom's interpretation. St. Augustine, on the other hand, St. Augustine identified the storm-tossed boat with the church. It is often called, through the church history, is called the bark of Peter. And Augustine said, Christian life is full of dangerous storms, especially attacks from evil spirits and temptations of the flesh. And then we must learn to trust Christ daily, since he alone can restrain these forces and bring us to the safe harbor of salvation. For the next few minutes, I want to follow St. Augustine's interpretation, and I want to apply it to our situation today, both in the church and in the world. And to begin, I want to point out that there are two important details in connection with this story. The first is, remember that most of the men in the boat that night were experienced professional fishermen. They were strong, they were self-reliant men, and they must have weathered many storms on the Sea of Galilee. Storms like that were common on the Sea of Galilee. So storms were no big deal. But on this particular night, the storm must have been exceptionally ferocious. I wonder why. And the disciples were so alarmed that they awakened Jesus and cried, Teacher, don't you care that we are dying?" They thought they were going to die. Clearly, this was no ordinary storm. And Jesus calmed them, and he calmed the storm too. For as we know, he alone has the supernatural power to make the waves obey him. And then he scolded the apostles for their lack of supernatural faith. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But the second detail in this story can only be seen when we read the story in its context. Verse 35 says, "On that day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And they went." It's worth noting that the only reason the apostles were in the boat that night was because Jesus had put them there. Okay? And usually we blow past that verse 35, and we move on to the storm, because that seems to be the action. But we do need to ask. We need to stop right here, and we need to ask. Jesus says, "Let us go across to the other side." And we need to ask, where was he going? What was on the other side that he wanted to go to? And we find that out. We don't find that out until the end of this story and the beginning of the next one. It begins in chapter 5, verse 1. And it says, They came to the other side, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately, by the way, that word's really important in Mark, immediate, because Mark is a gospel of action, and it's actually a battle of, it's a gospel about supernatural battle between Jesus and the forces of evil, and many things happen immediately, and it's important that as soon as Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. And it says, he lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. And night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. It's quite a frightening man. And I'm sure he was a notorious man. He was known. He was the demoniac. The Gerasene demoniac is what he's called. Gerasa and I would simply say that that's who Jesus wanted to see. That's why he said, let's go to the other side. Gerasa was one of the 10 cities of the Decapolis. The Decapolis were 10 Hellenized cities southeast of the Sea of Galilee. Very few Jews lived there, and the region was strongly pagan, filled with pagan polytheistic spirits and deities. And what's interesting is that when we read the story of the demoniac, we see that, strangely, immediately after the encounter and Jesus drove the spirits out of him, guess what they did? They got back in the boat and went back to the other side. They went back home. So it appears that Jesus took them there precisely to have this encounter with this possessed man. Why? Let me read a little more. It says that when the man saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." The man that everyone feared, the man that broke chains and shackles, fell down on his face before Jesus and said, "Do not torment me." For Jesus was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This was a man possessed with many, many demons, many spiritual maladies, many spiritual injuries on his soul. And Jesus freed him. Go on to read that Jesus drove the spirit out into a herd of pigs, and the pigs ran down and then drowned in the sea. Notice, in the storm, the danger for the disciples was they would drown in the sea, but as the way the story turns out, it was the pigs, it was the demonic spirits that drowned in the sea. See, this is the picture we're getting here. And the journey in the storm-tossed boat is directly connected to the demoniac at the tombs. And in fact, all three of the synoptic gospels have it that way. And the stories interpret each other, and here's what I think they mean. All three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us that at the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus came forth from the desert preaching, healing, and what else? Casting out demons. That's always mentioned in the context of his ministry. In fact, in Mark, the very first miracle of Jesus was to cast out a demon at the synagogue of Capernaum. The point is that the ministry of Jesus, we think of him as the kind healer or the man who brought peace or the teacher or the rabbi or whatever, all these sort of natural things, these good and holy things. But we forget that the ministry of Jesus was as much about spiritual warfare as it was about redemption. And in fact, in 1 John 3:8, it says, the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. The modern church has lost sight of this fact because of its anti-supernatural bias. And like the disciples in the boat in the midst of the storm who panicked and thought they were dying, to whom Jesus said, "Have you no faith?" These stories are a call to supernatural faith in light of these battles. When Jesus appointed the 12 apostles, what did he appoint them there for? Mark 3:14 tells us Jesus appointed the 12 to be with him, to be sent out to preach, and to have authority to cast out demons. This is part of what the church is about. To preach and have authority to cast out demons. That was the mission statement of the apostles, and that continues to be the mission statement of the church today. Matthew 16:18 says, Jesus is talking to Peter and says, "You are Peter, the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." See, Jesus established the church and gave it a supernatural mission. Sure, we have a worldly mission. We have the corporal works of mercy. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give water to the thirsty, etc. But we also have a supernatural one as well. To assail the gates of hell, doing battle with the devil is one of the chief jobs of the church today. And the demons we face today are legion. They are legion, aren't they? Out there, we are everyday faithful Catholics. We are dealing with the issues of abortion and pornography and rampant sexual immorality and anarchy and violence and corruption of the minds of our children in school and communism and every form of atheism. To use St. Pope John Paul II's term, our enemy is the culture of death. And the point is that we're not helpless before it. We are the church's soldiers and sailors, called to push back against it. The culture of death is very real and it's very powerful, and the only power strong enough to overcome it is Jesus Christ, the author of life. And so we need to have that supernatural faith that Jesus is about more than just his teachings and his parables. We need to remember the lesson of the boat in the storm. And this is important, and this brings me back to Augustine and his concept of the bark of Peter. When Jesus calls us into this battle, see, the point is, we're in this battle, and I think we all know we're in this battle. But the important point is that we're not alone. Jesus doesn't just send us out one at a time, or 2 by 2 even, to get slaughtered. Jesus created the church for us and called us into the church. He calls us into the bark of Peter, the church. And the church is Jesus' appointed vessel for us to be in our battle against the demons of our age. And we'll only be safe, and we will only be effective if we stay together, if we fight this battle as members of the church, as Catholics, as proudly Catholics. And we need to stay in the church, and we need to strengthen the church, and perhaps we need to even wake up Jesus in the church. It's significant that Jesus was asleep in the boat as they were panicking. Well, do we need to wake up Jesus in church, in today's church? And we need to have supernatural faith. I've said this before, and I'll say it again and again. Catholicism is nothing if it's not a supernatural faith. Everything about it that's essential is supernatural, beginning with the incarnation, the miracles, the resurrection. We need to have supernatural faith. And we cannot wage spiritual war on our own strength. We need the supernatural faith of Jesus, our Lord and leader. So, St. Augustine, as usual, was right. Life is full of dangerous storms, especially attacks from evil spirits and temptations of the flesh. And we must strengthen the church. We must learn to trust Christ daily. Trust that he is there in the boat with us, even though it seems like he's sleeping and not helping very much. And like the disciples, we might be tempted to cry out, "Teacher, don't you care if we perish?" He does care. And he's there. And he won't let us. So we must strengthen the church, learn to trust Christ daily, and since he alone is the one who can restrain these forces and bring us to the safe harbor of salvation. St. Peter and the holy apostles, pray for us.